Our next storyteller this evening is Robin Reineke. We are thrilled to have her here this evening. She's going to tell us a story about what drew her to make a difference in the lives of the people who try to cross the desert. Robin? There you are. I'm like, she's standing.
Hi, good evening. Can you hear me okay?
Keep it close.
Keep it close. Keep it close. Okay. So this story starts with happy hour at the Shanty in Tucson, Arizona. I don't know how many of you have ever been to the Shanty in Tucson. A good, beautiful, old, friendly establishment. You can picture the courtyard there at the Shanty. There's lemon trees that's very lush. There's the sound of bird song. There's a fountain that's usually covered in songbirds. There's spicy popcorn, and there's beer. I was visiting Tucson in 2006. I was deciding on a graduate program. I was 24 years old, and I had this idea as a young student looking for a graduate program in anthropology that I wanted to do something about human rights, something humanitarian, something involving social justice, aid, service, but I wasn't really sure where my path would take me, and I didn't really know what those things really meant. I didn't know how that work affects people once you get involved in what is humanitarian work. And I was meeting Bruce Anderson, Dr. Bruce Anderson, the forensic anthropologist of the Pima County Office of the Medical Examiner. I really didn't know who he was, but I understood that he was a forensic anthropologist, and they study bones, and they're the part of anthropology that gets involved when there's a crime or when someone is unidentified and skeletal. And I was interested in studying under Bruce at the University of Arizona. I met Bruce that day at the Shanty at 4 o'clock on a Friday. I was very nervous, and I remember thinking it was pretty cool that he wanted to meet over beer. So I was excited about that, and that kind of helped ease my nerves. I got a beer too. He was very, very tall, 6'5", very deep voice. And I remember very quickly the conversation got very serious. And Bruce said to me, you know, I do need help. I don't really teach at the university. What I do is I examine the dead at the medical examiner's office, and there's too many of them. And he said, I'm tired of having the same case on my table, which is a teenager whose bones have been found in the desert because he died trying to cross. He said, I would love to have you come and study with me. I would love to work with you, but I need help, and I can't in good conscience allow anyone to come here and just study. So if you're ready to help, come on down to Tucson and let's work together. And that was all the invitation that I needed. I didn't know what I was getting into, but okay, I will help. That suited my 24-year-old humanitarian spirit. So I still didn't really have a good sense of Tucson. I was imagining bumbleweed and a very harsh, terrifying desert. And I was moving from Seattle, my hometown, and it's very lush there, and I was kind of worried, oh, what am I doing with my life? Oh my gosh, Tucson, what's that? And I moved down to Tucson, and then as I started graduate school, I started also volunteering with Bruce at the medical examiner's office. To be honest with you, I was afraid of death. I wasn't drawn to work with Bruce because I was interested in the dead or dead bodies. Again, I was drawn from this kind of like human rights, humanitarian aid, service, care perspective. I was afraid of the dead, and here I was in a medical examiner's office. I approached that space like I had a yardstick, like measuring my distance to death and creepy things, and I didn't really want to smell them or see them or hear anything. So I had my little laptop at the library of the medical examiner's office, and basically what Bruce needed help with was to organize the list of the missing, because Bruce was too busy, just overwhelmed and deeply, deeply committed. And he was, as he had said, you know, the very similar case on his examining table every day, 175 on average being recovered from the desert at that time. 175 per year. That's like a small plane crash, medium-sized plane crash, every single year. Only with a plane crash, you usually have a manifest. You have a sense of who those people were. In the desert, you don't have a list. You don't know where to turn. Who are these people? Where are the missing? Where are the families? Well, what Bruce was also overwhelmed with at the medical examiner's office was the families were calling directly to the medical examiner's office because they couldn't go to police, because either the police would turn them away because they're calling from Oaxaca and it's an international case, or because they're undocumented and they're afraid that more family separation could lead to someone else disappearing on the border. So what were they doing? They were calling the medical examiner's office directly. And Bruce, being a kind, compassionate person that he was writing down the missing persons reports in a big binder, keeping track. Okay, Blanca, she was 5'4", she crossed July 4th, 2002. Jose Ramiro, he was from Oaxaca, and he had a tattoo of an eagle. So he was keeping track of all of these details, but he was overwhelmed, and he was scared he was missing possibilities of making matches. So in those early years at the medical examiner's office in the library, I sat there and I took Bruce's old reports and I learned how to use Excel. I didn't know how to use Microsoft Excel, so I figured out how to put all the little names into the little cells and be able to sort and organize them. I got used to going into the medical examiner's office. I got a little bit more used to the sights and the smells and the fluorescent light, and I knew that Bruce would be back in the lab and that I should knock and be prepared for whatever I was going to see there. Then as I organized the list of the missing, I started to work with Bruce on comparing those records to the unidentified dead. And pretty soon it got to the point where, I'd go back to Bruce's lab and I'd say, hey, we have these two sisters, Erika and Estela, and they're missing together, and they're in their mid-20s, and they disappeared in April. Any, 2 cases that were found together, so we would, and these are all real examples, so we would compare back and forth, we would check in with one another. He would come to me and he'd say, hey, I've got a guy and he's missing this upper front tooth. Do you have anything in your list? So I figured out how to sort and filter, and we started to make shorter lists, and we started to make matches. And there's one match that I was responsible for that kind of changed everything for me. I think at that point I knew the work was important. I was committed to it. I had studied Spanish to try to do the best that I could, in case the families were going to talk to me. But mainly I was trying to make matches, and I was trying to organize everything, so at least there would be one list. So if Bruce had one skeleton on his table, at least he could know that this list was pretty much complete. So I was collecting the reports from the consulates and from Border Patrol, and police had a few, and No More Deaths had a few, Coalición de Derechos Humanos had a few, putting them all in one list. I became obsessed with the data, and I saw it more or less as data, but important data. And then in the summer of 2008, I remember speaking with a family of a missing man named Carmen. And I spoke with the brother who was in North Carolina. And I remember hearing a little bit about Carmen's story and understanding that he had crossed, just a couple weeks back. This was in July of 2008. So he crossed like in early July. And there was this feeling of, wow, this person is walking through the landscape where I live and where I can go out and go hiking and enjoy the Sonoran Desert 20, 30 miles from where I'm sitting right now. And this person was left behind because his knee was hurting and he was distressed and he didn't have enough water, and he was left behind in the blazing sun in July. So I remembered that. And then later on in the summer, I remember a case coming in, so a deceased person being found in the desert. And the remains were kind of, there was nothing that really stood out, highly decomposed, very tragic to look at, like any of the remains, unfortunately, that we see in the medical examiner's office. But there was this clue. There was a little saint card. It was a saint that I hadn't recognized, but it was a little prayer card to a saint. And on the back, it had this word that I remember was kind of written around the corner in scrawling handwriting, and it said, Akatandela. I was like, oh, what's a catandela? And with my beginning Spanish, I'm like Googling a catandela. I dreamed about the word. I was so curious, like, what was it? And then later on in October, it wasn't until October of 2008, I looked back at this case and I noticed that the man had a blue shirt, black pants, and red and black shoes. Identical clothing description to Carmen, the man who I had taken the missing persons report for in July of that summer. And I had this punch in the gut feeling of like, oh, I missed it. Like the family's been waiting since July. It took me until October to notice, and his brother told me exactly those clothing, the blue Dickies shirt, black Dickies pants, blue button-up shirt, and red and black like tennis shoes, and how could I not notice it? Of course, there were hundreds of missing persons reports, hundreds of unidentified dead that summer. I called back Carmen's brother right away, and I said, hey, remains were found, and the clothing is really similar to Carmen. What do you think? Do you want to take a look at the photos of the clothing and see if you recognize anything? So I emailed him, and I was kind of focused on the clothing, and I emailed him a photo of this saint card, this prayer card, front and back, with the writing on it, and he called back right away. And he said, I know that's my brother, because that's our patron saint of our hometown in Guerrero, and it says Acatlan de la Cruz is their hometown. So it wasn't Acatandela, he was just writing it close. Acatlan de la Cruz was their hometown. The reason that Carmen was crossing is because their hometown had been devastated by economic trade policies, essentially, that made it so that they had a small, tiny little corn and bean farm, and they really couldn't compete. His parents' generation were the last generation that could really take their corn and bean to the market and actually make a living that way. Destruction hit in the mid-90s for that family. There were 8 brothers. They couldn't dice up that plot of land any further, and they really couldn't compete selling their corn and beans in the market. They were competing with the likes of Monsanto and huge agribusiness. So one by one, the 8 brothers all migrated, and Carmen was the youngest, and he'd stayed behind to take care of his aging parents. When they finally passed away, he went north too. So that case kind of changed everything for me, in the sense of I had this feeling, maybe in a way that I hadn't had before, of like responsibility. And I felt that this crisis was so big and way too big for me, and it needed something bigger. And it was not good that it was an accident that I happened to notice these blue shirt and black pants. It was not good enough that could have slipped through my fingers. So that's when we decided to found Colibri, Center for Human Rights, to really create a safe place for families to call, families like Carmen that needed to get information and not have to go to the police and feel afraid of being deported, while they're already going through the experience of knowing that it's very likely that their little brother is dead in the desert and alone and uncared for. So we started Colibri really to help families like Carmen's. There are sadly thousands. We don't have even good numbers. Colibri's database contains records for about 2,500 people who've disappeared. Another 8,000 to 9,000 bodies have been found along the entire US-Mexico border over the last 20 years. And those numbers come from Border Patrol, and they're not really very complete. They only include the cases where Border Patrol was involved. So there's numerous counties in South Texas that are finding bodies, and those are not really a part of that count. But these are not numbers. These are people like Carmen, and they're people that are searching for years without information about their missing loved ones. The crisis is still too big. Colibri is still tiny. We're a team of 4 very devoted people. We work with the families. We still work with Bruce. We're doing everything that we can do to connect the dots, to partner with the families so that their stories come out, so that people understand. People like Carmen are not trying to do anyone harm. They're doing the best that they can. They're fleeing their own hurricane. You know, they're coming because it's the last choice, not the first choice. last month, only just a couple weeks ago, I was in New York City with the Colibri team, and we were meeting with relatives of the missing face-to-face. And we now finally have some funding to be able to collect DNA, which is really powerful, because you can imagine that with hundreds of skeletal remains and decomposed remains and hundreds of missing people, it's very hard. So those clues, the fact that it came down to, these clothing, and even then it took DNA to identify Carmen. Now we finally have some funding to be able to go collect the DNA from the families and send that to the lab where it can be compared against the unidentified dead. And when I was in New York, I met with Karen, who's a young woman who right around the same time that I helped to identify Carmen's body, I talked with Karen about her missing mother. Karen is Peruvian, and her mother crossed in 2009, and we still have no clues, no leads on her mother's whereabouts. Her mother is still missing. But there was something very powerful about seeing Karen again nearly 10 years later in New York, and being able to collect her DNA and help her in her search in this very intimate way, that this little piece of her will go to the search for her mom, and maybe, just maybe, it'll be the thing that finally brings her mom home. But it felt really good to see Karen and to see that she's okay and that she's thriving. She has a degree in electrical engineering. She's funny, she's beautiful, she's working on buying a house. She misses her mom. It tears her up that she doesn't know where her mom is, but she's never gonna stop searching. And as long as she's searching, I will be there too, and so will Colibri. We're not just searching for Karen's mom, we're not just searching for Carmen, but we're searching for better solutions. We already have a wall. We know it's killing people. We have a wall and it's killing people, and we can do better. We can do better for people like Carmen and people like Karen. There are better solutions. And one of the biggest steps that we can take is just to acknowledge the unique, individual, irreplaceable lives. And that's what we do at Colibri. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin, for that story. Dr. Robin Reineke is, as she mentioned, the founder of the Colibri Center for Human Rights in Tucson. And we really admire and appreciate the way she saw a need and felt it within herself to actually try and do something about it. One of the stories that I worked on for this project was actually about migrant deaths, and Robin is one of the people that I interviewed along with her staff. And I remember what really struck me from those interviews was the terrible, unbearable anguish that relatives of migrants go through when they go missing in the desert. So no matter what you think about the people who cross the desert, the reality is, for those family members, the suffering is very real. So I really admire the way Robin so capably took on this calling.